Welcome to our channel of emotionally captivating historical stories. Before we dive into this incredible Viking tale, please subscribe, hit that like button, and let us know in the comments which part of the world you're watching from. Your support means everything to us. Now let's journey back to the age of Vikings. The bitter winds of the Norwegian fjords howled through the dense pine forests as Bjorn Ironwill trudged through the snow-laden path, his weathered boots leaving deep impressions in the pristine white carpet beneath him. The year was 934 AD, and winter had arrived early in the mountainous regions surrounding his village of Ravenshollow, nestled deep within the shadowy embrace of the Hardangerfjord. At 32 winters old, Bjorn stood as tall as the ancient oaks that dotted his homeland, his auburn beard thick with frost, and his grey eyes sharp as the steel blade that hung at his side. The leather satchel across his broad shoulders contained the meagre supplies he had managed to trade for in the distant settlement of Thornwick: dried fish, barley grain, and precious salt that would help his isolated village survive the harsh months ahead. Ravenshollow had endured a particularly difficult harvest season, with early frosts destroying much of their grain stores and a series of storms driving away the fish from their usual coastal hunting grounds. As Bjorn navigated the treacherous mountain pass known as Windcutter's Ridge, the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western peaks, casting long shadows that danced eerily across the snow-covered landscape. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and he knew he needed to reach the shelter of Ironbark Cave before nightfall, or risk becoming another casualty of the unforgiving Nordic winter. The cave, a natural formation carved by centuries of wind and water, had served as a way station for travelers for generations. Its entrance, partially hidden by hanging icicles and snow-heavy pine branches, offered protection from the elements and a place to rest before the final push toward home. As Bjorn approached the familiar landmark, his keen hunter's instincts detected something unusual, a faint, almost musical sound echoing from within the cave's depths. Pushing aside the ice-encrusted branches that obscured the entrance, Bjorn stepped into the relative warmth of the cavern. The sound became clearer now, a weak, plaintive cry that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly resonance. His hand instinctively moved to the hilt of his sayax, the single-edged knife that had served him faithfully in countless situations. As he ventured deeper into the cave's shadowy interior, the flickering light from his small oil lamp revealed the cave's familiar features: the smooth walls worn by countless seasons, the small chamber where he had spent many nights during his trading journeys, and the natural chimney that allowed smoke to escape. But there, in the furthest corner of the cave, partially hidden behind a fallen boulder, was something that made Bjorn's breath catch in his throat. A creature no larger than a hunting hound lay curled against the cold stone, its scales a deep emerald green that seemed to shimmer even in the dim lamplight. Its wings, delicate as autumn leaves but tough as leather, were folded tightly against its body, and its serpentine neck curved gracefully as it lifted its triangular head to regard the approaching human. Most striking of all were its eyes, large, intelligent, and filled with an ancient wisdom that seemed impossible for such a young creature. Bjorn had heard the stories, passed down through generations of skaldic tradition, of the great worms that once soared through the northern skies. His grandfather, Olaf the Stormcaller, had claimed to have seen one during his youth, describing creatures of immense power and intelligence that commanded both fear and respect from mortal men. But those were tales from the distant past, stories told around winter fires to entertain children and honor the old ways. Yet here before him was undeniable proof that such creatures still existed, though this particular specimen appeared to be barely clinging to life. The young dragon's breathing was labored, its scales had lost much of their natural luster, and Bjorn could see the prominent outline of its ribs through its thin hide. The creature was starving, likely separated from its parent, and unable to hunt effectively in the harsh winter conditions. The dragon's eyes met Bjorn's, and in that moment, the Viking warrior felt a connection that transcended the boundaries between species. There was no aggression in those ancient eyes, only desperate need and a plea for help that needed no words. The creature's tail, tipped with small but sharp spines, twitched weakly as it tried to raise its head higher, the effort clearly taxing what little strength remained. Bjorn slowly approached, speaking in the soft, rhythmic tones he used to calm frightened animals. "Easy there, little one," he murmured in Old Norse, his deep voice echoing gently off the cave walls. "I mean you no harm." The dragon's nostrils flared as it caught his scent, but it made no move to flee or attack, perhaps too weak for either option. Setting down his pack, Bjorn carefully extracted a portion of his dried fish, some of the precious supplies meant to sustain his own village through the coming winter. The salty ocean fish, caught in the rich waters of the North Sea, represented hours of labor and considerable trade value. Yet as he looked into the dragon's pleading eyes, Bjorn felt no hesitation about his decision. He broke the fish into smaller pieces, aware that the creature's digestive system might be delicate in its weakened state. "Here, young friend," he said, extending his hand, slowly palm up, with several pieces of the dried fish. The dragon's nostrils flared again, this time with obvious interest, and it carefully extended its neck to sniff at the offering. The first tentative bite was followed by more eager consumption as the starving creature realized that sustenance had finally arrived. Bjorn continued to feed the dragon piece by piece, observing its reactions carefully and adjusting the portions to avoid overwhelming its system. As the creature ate, some of the dullness began to leave its scales, and its breathing became noticeably easier. "You're far from home, aren't you?" Bjorn asked, settling cross-legged on the cave floor as the dragon continued to eat. "The great nesting grounds are said to be in the far northern reaches, beyond the ice fields, where even the boldest Vikings dare not venture. How did you come to be alone in these mountains?" The dragon paused in its feeding to regard Bjorn with those remarkably intelligent eyes, tilting its head in a gesture that seemed almost human in its curiosity. It made a soft sound, part purr and part chirp, that resonated strangely in the confined space of the cave. Then, with surprising gentleness for a creature armed with sharp claws and teeth, it extended its neck and briefly touched its snout to Bjorn's outstretched hand. The contact sent an unexpected warmth through the Viking's weathered palm, not just physical heat, but something deeper, a sense of gratitude and recognition that seemed to flow directly from the dragon's consciousness to his own. In that moment, Bjorn understood that he was experiencing something that few humans in history had ever encountered, a direct connection with one of the ancient worms. Over the next several hours, as the winter storm intensified outside the cave, Bjorn shared more of his supplies with his unexpected companion. He rationed the food carefully, giving the dragon enough to stabilize its condition while ensuring that he would still have sufficient provisions to complete his journey home. The creature seemed to understand the sacrifice being made on its behalf, accepting each offering with a dignity that spoke to its noble heritage. As the night deepened, Bjorn built a small fire near the cave's natural chimney, the flames providing warmth and light for both occupants. The dragon, now somewhat restored by the food and warmth, moved closer to the fire, its scales reflecting the dancing flames in mesmerizing patterns. The creature's presence filled the cave with an otherworldly atmosphere, as if the very air had become charged with ancient magic. "I've spent my entire life following the warrior's path," Bjorn said, speaking more to himself than to his companion as he tended the fire. "Fighting in raids, protecting my village, living by the sword and the strength of my arm. But tonight, sharing this cave with you, I feel as though I'm touching something far greater than any battle or conquest." The dragon listened with obvious attention, its head resting on its forelegs, occasionally making soft sounds that seemed almost conversational in nature. As the hours passed, Bjorn found himself telling the creature about his life, his childhood in Ravenshollow, his father's death in a raid against the Danes, his responsibilities as one of the village's primary providers and protectors. When dawn finally broke, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold visible through the cave entrance, both man and dragon knew that their paths must diverge. The creature had regained enough strength to continue its journey, though Bjorn worried about its ability to survive alone in the harsh wilderness. The dragon seemed to sense his concern, approaching him one final time and pressing its snout gently against his hand in a gesture of farewell and gratitude. "Be safe, little friend," Bjorn whispered as the dragon made its way toward the cave entrance. "May the old gods watch over you and guide you back to your kin." The creature paused at the threshold, looking back at the human who had shown it such unexpected kindness, then spread its wings and launched itself into the crisp morning air. Bjorn watched from the cave entrance as the dragon's silhouette grew smaller against the pale winter sky until it disappeared entirely beyond the distant peaks. He remained there for several long minutes, wondering if he had dreamed the entire encounter before the cold finally drove him back inside to prepare for the final leg of his journey home. 15 years had passed since that fateful winter night in Ironbark Cave, and Bjorn Ironwill, now bearing the silver threads of approaching old age in his auburn beard, had never spoken of his encounter with the dragon Wyrmling. The memory remained vivid in his mind, as clear as the morning he had watched the young creature disappear into the mountain sky, but he had kept it locked away in his heart like a precious secret. Ravenshollow had prospered in the intervening years. Under Bjorn's leadership as the village's acknowledged chieftain, the settlement had expanded from a struggling cluster of longhouses to a thriving community of nearly 200 souls. New families had arrived, drawn by tales of the village's success in fishing, farming, and metalworking. The harbour had been expanded to accommodate larger vessels, and trade relationships had been established with communities as far away as the Orkney Islands and the coast of Ireland. The village now boasted a proper smithy run by the skilled craftsman Thorvald Hammerson, whose iron tools and weapons were renowned throughout the fjord region. Astrid Seafoam, a wise woman learned in the healing arts, tended to the medical needs of the community from her herb-filled longhouse near the village centre. Young children played in the streets under the watchful eyes of their elders, their laughter echoing off the wooden walls and thatched roofs that had become a symbol of prosperity and security. But on this particular autumn evening, as the harvest celebration reached its peak and the entire village gathered in the great hall to feast and share stories, none could have predicted that their peaceful existence was about to be shattered by a threat unlike any they had ever faced. The first sign of trouble came from young Eric Swiftfoot, barely 16 winters old, but already showing promise as a hunter and scout. He burst through the heavy oak doors of the great hall, his face flushed from running and his eyes wide with terror. The festive atmosphere immediately shifted to one of alarm as the villagers recognized the expression of someone who had witnessed something beyond normal comprehension. "Fire!" Eric gasped, struggling to catch his breath as all eyes turned toward him. "The southern forest. It burns like the forge of the gods themselves. But this is no ordinary fire. It moves against the wind and the smoke. The smoke glows with an unholy light." Bjorn rose from his place at the high table, his hand instinctively moving to the sword at his side. Years of experience had taught him to read the subtle signs of genuine terror versus mere excitement, and everything about Eric's demeanor spoke of authentic fear. "Speak clearly, boy," he commanded in the authoritative tone that had served him well as both warrior and leader. "What exactly did you see?" Eric took a deep breath, steadying himself before continuing. "I was checking the hunting traps in White Pine Grove when I saw the glow on the horizon. At first, I thought it might be distant lightning, but as I climbed to higher ground, I could see that entire sections of the forest were aflame. The fire spreads faster than any natural blaze I've ever witnessed, and—" He paused, struggling to find words for what he had observed. "And I swear by Odin's ravens that I saw shapes moving within the flames, shapes too large to be bears or elk." A murmur of concern rippled through the assembled villagers. Forest fires were a known danger in the dry autumn season, But Eric's description suggested something far more ominous than a typical woodland blaze. Thorvald Hammerson stood from his bench, his massive frame casting a long shadow in the firelight. "How far?" he asked tersely. "Perhaps 2 hours fast march," Eirik replied. "But at the speed it's moving, it could reach the outer fields before dawn." Bjorn felt a cold certainty settle in his stomach. Raven's-Hollow's prosperity depended largely on the surrounding forests and fields. The lumber supported their construction and shipbuilding efforts, while the cleared farmland provided the grain that sustained them through the harsh winters. A fire of the magnitude Eirik described could destroy everything they had worked so hard to build. "Gather the bucket brigades," Bjorn ordered, his mind already shifting into the tactical mode that had served him in countless battles. "Thorvald, organize teams to dig fire breaks around the village perimeter. Astrid, prepare the healer's station and gather supplies for treating burns and smoke inhalation. Women and children to the stone houses near the harbour. They'll be safest there if the fire reaches the village itself." As the villagers began to move with the practiced efficiency of a community that had faced hardship before, Bjorn made his way to the hall's highest window, a narrow opening that provided a view toward the southern approaches. What he saw there made his blood run cold. The entire southern horizon glowed with an orange-red light that pulsed and flickered like a living thing. Even from this distance, he could smell the smoke on the evening breeze, thick and acrid with the scent of burning pine, and something else, something that reminded him of brimstone and ancient volcanic ash. The evacuation proceeded with remarkable speed and organization. Families gathered their most precious possessions, while teams of men assembled the firefighting equipment that every Nordic village maintained against such emergencies. Leather buckets, long-handled tools for creating fire breaks, and wet woolen blankets that could be used to smother smaller blazes were distributed among the able-bodied adults. But as the night wore on and the glow on the horizon grew steadily brighter and closer, it became increasingly clear that their conventional firefighting methods would be inadequate against whatever was approaching. The fire seemed to possess an intelligence of its own, shifting direction unpredictably and consuming everything in its path with supernatural voracity. By midnight, the outer edge of the conflagration had reached the border of their cultivated lands. Bjorn stood with a group of his most trusted warriors on a small hill overlooking the threatened fields, watching in fascination and horror as the flames advanced like a living army. The heat was so intense that they could feel it on their faces from nearly a mile away, and the roar of the burning forest sounded like the rage of the gods themselves. "It's no use," muttered Gunnar Bloodaxe, one of Bjorn's oldest friends and a veteran of countless raids and battles. "We might as well try to fight the ocean with our bare hands. Whatever force drives this fire, it's beyond mortal understanding." As if summoned by his words, a new horror emerged from the wall of flames. Creatures of living fire, their forms only vaguely resembling the beasts of the natural world, began to pour out of the conflagration like molten demons released from the underworld. They moved with predatory grace across the landscape, leaving trails of ignited grass and shrubs in their wake, their eyes glowing like forge coals in the darkness. The villagers who had remained to fight the fire began to fall back in terror, their courage finally broken by the sight of enemies that existed beyond their comprehension of natural law. Even the bravest warriors, men who had faced death in battle without flinching, found their spirits quailing before creatures that seemed to embody destruction itself. It was then, in the darkest moment of their desperate situation, that salvation came from the most unexpected quarter. A shadow passed overhead, so large that it momentarily blocked out the stars, followed by a sound that Bjorn recognized but had not heard in 15 long years, the musical cry of a dragon in flight. The great worm that descended from the night sky bore little resemblance to the starving Wyrmling that Bjorn had nursed back to health in Ironbark Cave. This was a creature in the full glory of its maturity, easily the length of a longship from snout to tail, with wings that could have sheltered half the village beneath their span. Its scales had darkened from emerald green to a deep forest color that seemed to absorb and reflect the firelight in mesmerizing patterns. And its eyes, those same intelligent, ancient eyes, now burned with a power that spoke of wisdom gained and strength fully realized. The dragon's arrival on the battlefield was like the intervention of the gods themselves. With controlled precision that demonstrated complete mastery over its elemental nature, the great beast began to combat the supernatural fire that threatened Raven's Hollow. Where the fire demons had brought destruction, the dragon brought a different kind of flame, one that consumed the hostile energies and restored natural order to the burning landscape. The battle between dragonfire and the supernatural conflagration was unlike anything witnessed in human memory. Streams of controlled flame flowed from the dragon's throat, meeting and neutralizing the chaotic energies of the attacking fire. Where the two forces met, the air itself seemed to crystallize and shatter, creating aurora-like displays that painted the night sky in impossible colors. The fire demons, creatures that had seemed invincible moments before, found themselves unable to withstand the dragon's assault. One by one, they were consumed by the purifying flames, their forms dissolving back into the natural fire from which they had been spawned. The supernatural intelligence that had driven the forest fire began to weaken and fragment as its servants were destroyed. Throughout this cosmic battle, Bjorn stood transfixed, recognizing in the dragon's movements and tactics the same intelligence and nobility he had glimpsed in the starving Wyrmling so many years before. When the creature's gaze met his across the battlefield, he saw not just recognition, but gratitude, a debt remembered and finally repaid. The tide of the battle turned decisively as the dragon's efforts began to take effect. The wall of supernatural fire started to collapse back upon itself, its advancing edge retreating toward the deeper forest. The fire demons, deprived of their source of power, faded like shadows at sunrise, leaving behind only the natural fires that could be fought with conventional methods. As dawn broke over the smoke-filled landscape, the dragon's work was complete. The supernatural threat had been neutralized, and what remained was a manageable forest fire that the villagers could combat with their traditional techniques. The great worm circled the village once more, as if taking a final survey of the area it had protected before coming to rest on the same hill where Bjorn stood with his warriors. The dragon's massive head lowered until it was level with Bjorn's own, and once again, after 15 years, the two beings who had shared that cave made direct contact. The dragon's snout touched Bjorn's outstretched hand with the same gentle precision it had shown as a Wyrmling, but now the warmth that flowed between them carried the weight of a mature creature's full power and wisdom. "Old friend," Bjorn whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he recognized the truth of the situation. "You remembered. After all these years, you remembered a kindness shown to you when you needed it most." "Ace." The dragon's response was a sound that somehow managed to convey affection, gratitude, and farewell, all at once. It remained for several more minutes, allowing the other villagers to witness the miracle of peaceful contact between human and worm, before finally spreading its great wings and launching itself back into the morning sky. As the dragon's silhouette disappeared toward the northern mountains, Bjorn felt a profound sense of completion. The circle had been closed, the debt repaid, and both he and the village he had devoted his life to protecting had been preserved by the memory of a simple act of compassion performed so long ago. Years passed, and Bjorn Ironwill eventually joined his ancestors in the halls of Valhalla, but the story of the dragon that saved Raven's Hollow became the stuff of legend. The village prospered beyond all previous measure, protected by the knowledge that somewhere in the northern reaches, a great worm watched over them with benevolent eyes. Children born after the Night of Fire, as it came to be known, grew up hearing the tale of their former chieftain's encounter with the dragon Wyrmling, and how a simple act of kindness during a harsh winter had ultimately saved their entire community. The story was carved into the wooden pillars of the great hall, painted on the shields of the village's warriors, and woven into the songs that traveling skalds carried to distant lands. Astrid Seafoam, who lived to the remarkable age of 93, often said that she could still see the dragon's silhouette on clear nights, flying high above the fjord as it continued its eternal patrol. Whether this was truth or the fancy of an aging mind, none could say for certain, but the belief provided comfort to generations of villagers who faced their own hardships and challenges. The cave where Bjorn and the Wyrmling had first met became a place of pilgrimage for those seeking to understand the deeper connections between all living beings. Travelers would leave small offerings of food there, not in expectation of encountering a dragon themselves, but as a symbol of their commitment to showing kindness to those in need, regardless of how different or strange they might appear. The true lesson of Bjorn Ironwill and his dragon friend echoed through the generations, that acts of compassion, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, have the power to create bonds that transcend species, time, and circumstance. In a world often dominated by conflict and struggle, their story served as a reminder that kindness, once given freely, has a way of returning when it is needed most. And so the legend lived on, passed from parent to child, from skald to audience, carrying with it the eternal truth that friendship knows no boundaries, and that the greatest treasures are often found not in gold or glory, but in the simple act of reaching out to help another soul in need. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible historical tales. Like this video if it touched your heart, and comment below to share which part of the world you're watching from. Until next time, may your own acts of kindness return to you tenfold.